This is Mrs. Edwards, and I just want to welcome you to the review and preview problems number 765 to 771. Problem 765 says point M is the midpoint of line segment AB and B is the midpoint of line segment AC. So by the definition of midpoint, we know that piece AM, or line segment AM, is equal to line segment MB. So we can take 4x minus 1 and set that equal to x plus 8, use our inverse operations to get x is equal to 3. We then know that by the definition of midpoint, line segment AB is congruent to line segment BC. So the first thing we need to do is we need to take our x value and we need to plug it into both of these pieces. So we have 4 times 3 minus 1 plus piece MB, 3 plus 8 is equal to 5y plus 2. We combined our like terms following our order of operations. So we get 22 is equal to 5y plus 2. Inverse operations is to subtract our 2. Inverse of multiplication is division, so we get y is equal to 4. Seven 66 says read the math notes box in this lesson and then answer in the following questions. So in the math notes box, it is going to remind you of how to solve these percent problems. The cost of a large flat screen TV is decreasing by 20% each year. So if something is decreasing by 20% each year, you only want to pay for 80%, or that television is only worth 80% of its original price. So when it asks us to find the multiplier, the first thing we need to do is we need to change 20% into a decimal, which is 0.2. So if we take 100% of the television and decrease it by 20%, we are left with 80. So our multiplier, written as a decimal, is 0.8. If a 50-inch flat screen now costs $1,200, what will it cost in 3 years? So 3 years from now, our price should be going down or decreasing because it's losing value. So we're going to take our initial cost of $1,200. We are going to multiply that by our multiplier because we're writing an exponential equation, and we want to replace our variable that is in place of our exponent with 3 because they said we want to know in 3 years how much will it cost. We follow our order of operations, and we know 0.8 to the third power times 1,200 is approximately $614.40. At the same rate, what did it cost 2 years ago? So what did it cost 2 years ago, 2 years previous, tells us that this should cost more. So if you do your math and it doesn't cost more, you need to reevaluate. So we start with our original amount of 1,200. We know our multiplier is 0.8. None of that is going to change. But if we want to talk about 2 years prior, we're going to use a -2 as our exponent. So when we type this into the calculator, we can see that the TV 2 years prior cost $1,875. Problem 767 says a light directed from point E is pointed at a hinged mirror with a right angle as shown below. If the measure of angle X is 36 degrees, find the measures of angle A, angle R, angle M, angle Y, and angle Z. So if we think back to our previous properties and theorems, we know that our angle of incidence and our angle of reflection are congruent, which tells us that our angle of incidence and our angle of reflection are congruent. So angle X is congruent to angle A. So we know that A is 36 degrees. We then know that this triangle right here, we can take 90 degrees and subtract 30 to get angle R, which is 54 degrees. I then know that angles A, Z, and X all need to add to 180 degrees because they form a straight angle. So if I take 180 minus 36 minus 36, that will tell me that angle Z is 108 degrees. I also know that my corresponding angles should equal 180 degrees. So 180 minus 108 tells me that angle Y is 72 degrees. Angles R, Y, and M form a straight line which equals 180 degrees. 180 minus 54 minus 72 tells me that angle M is also 54 degrees. Why must the arrows at points A and E be parallel? So A must be parallel to E, and we can tell that because angle Y and angle Z are supplementary interior same side angles, which we know equals 180 degrees, and in fact 108 degrees plus 72 degrees equals 180 degrees. 768 on graph paper, graph the quadrilateral MNPQ. You can see that I graphed M at negative 3, 6, N at 2, 8, P at 1, 5, and Q at 4, negative 3. Notice that each of these counts by 2, so be very careful when you're looking at your graph. What shape is MNPQ? Show how you know. So it is a parallelogram. And I know that because line segment MN is parallel to line segment QP. And you could show that using slope triangles. Is one way to show that. So MN is parallel to QP. You could also use slope triangles to prove that MQ is parallel to NP. You could also use the Pythagorean theorem and find the distance of those lines would be another way. Use the function x implies x and y implies negative y to reflect M and PQ across the x-axis and create M prime, N prime, P prime, Q prime. What are the coordinates of P prime? So if you reflect each of these points, so you start at this point, 1, 2, 3 away from the x-axis, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 away from the x-axis, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you would see that point P prime would be approximately at the ordered pair 1, negative 5. 769, Jester starts to prove that the triangles below are congruent. He was only told that point E is the midpoint of segment AC and BD. So we then know if the E is the midpoint, line segment AE has to be congruent to line segment EC. If E is the midpoint of BD, we know that line segment BE has to be congruent to line segment ED. These two angles right here we know are vertical angles, and we know that vertical angles are congruent just by looking at our diagram. So the next step says copy and complete his flowchart below. Be sure that the reason is provided for every statement. So looking at our diagram, we could conclude that angle AEB is congruent to angle CED by the definition of vertical angles are congruent. We were given the fact that E is a midpoint. So if we know E is a midpoint, we could then derive that line segment AE is congruent to line segment CE by the definition of midpoint. We could also say that line segment BE is congruent to line segment DE by the definition of midpoint. We then could prove that triangle AEB is congruent to triangle CED by the justification or reason of side angle side congruency. 770, for a school fair, Donnie is going to design a spinner with red, white, and blue regions. Since he has a certain proportion of 3 types of prizes, he wants the P of red to be 40%, P of white to be 10%. If the spinner only has red, white, and blue, what is the proportion of blue? Well, if I know that the spinner only has 3 portions, it has to equal 100. If 40% of it is red and 10% of it is white, that leaves the other percent, or the blue percent, to be 50%. It then says find the central angles of this spinner if it has only 3 sections. Then draw a sketch of the spinner. So if we draw our sketch of the spinner, and we know that blue represents 50%, white represents 10%, and red represents 40%, we can draw something that looks like this. So for our red area, we would want to take 0.4 because it's 40%, multiply that by 360 degrees, which would tell us that the red area is 144 degrees. Looking at our blue area, we know that blue represents 50% of our circle. So if we take 360 and we multiply that by 0.5, we get 180 degrees. And you notice that it is a semicircle, which also forms a straight line. So it makes sense to be 180. To find our white proportion, we have 10%. So we do 0.1 times 360, which gives us 36 degrees. If we add 140, 36, and 180 all up, we are back at 360 degrees and can verify that we did it correctly. Is there a different spinner that has the same probabilities? If so, sketch another spinner that has the same probabilities. If not, explain why there is no other spinner with the same probabilities. Well, when we think about this, yes, there absolutely could be another spinner that has the same probabilities. There can be more than 3 sections to a spinner, but the ratio of the areas for each color must match the ratios for the spinner in part B. So the important thing is we want to make sure that the ratios match. 771 says, on graph paper, graph and shade the solution for the inequality below. So when we graph an inequality, we want to graph our line first. If our inequality symbol is less than or greater than with no equal to underneath it, that tells us it has a dotted line and any points on that dotted line are not included. This inequality is set up in slope-intercept form, so we know that 5 is our y-intercept. So you can see on my graph I started at the point 5. And my slope is down 2, 1, 2, right 3 each time. Down 2, right 3, and you put a point on your graph. Down 2, right 3, and you can see we have our graph. Again, the inequality symbol tells us it's a dotted line. Y is less than all the other values, so we shade lower. And you can see the green portion of our graph, if you plugged any of those ordered pairs into the inequality, would give us a true statement. The points on the dotted line are not solutions to the inequality.